welcome to this week's episode of Did Shakespeare. My name is Cassidy Cash. John Smith's exploration of New England coincided with the same year Shakespeare started performances at the Blackfriars Theatre, as well as when we think Shakespeare wrote The Tempest. The Tempest was first performed in 1611, just 2 years after John Smith's exploration to New England. And since this play, as well as Twelfth Night and A Winter's Tale, include details that cause us to suspect Shakespeare was staying abreast of the massive current events issues surrounding exploration and discoveries abroad, this week we are asking about one of the most famous of English colonists by asking, did Shakespeare know John Smith? John Smith was a celebrated soldier, explorer, and colonial governor in England. He was Admiral of New England and a prolific author. He was the first English explorer ever to map the Chesapeake Bay area. John Smith set off at age 16 after his father died to serve as a mercenary in the army of Henry IV of France. He fought against the Spaniards, fighting for Dutch independence from King Philip II of Spain. He would then go on to the Mediterranean, where he engaged in trade and even piracy. He later fought against the Ottoman Turks in the Long Turkish War. It was during this war that he was both promoted to cavalry captain while fighting for the Austrian Habsburgs in Hungary, and in the campaign of Michael the Brave in 1600 and 1601. John Smith is said to have beheaded 3 Ottoman challengers in a single combat duel, for which he was knighted by the Prince of Transylvania and given a horse and a coat of arms showing 3 Turkish heads. However, in 1602, he was wounded by the Crimean Tartars, captured, and sold as a slave. While he was enslaved, John Smith claimed that his master was a Turkish nobleman who sent him as a gift to a Greek mistress in Constantinople. After his slavery in Constantinople, he was taken to the Crimea, where he escaped from the Ottoman lands into Muscovy, and then went on to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth before traveling through Europe and North Africa, finally making it back to England in 1604. In 1606, John Smith became involved with the Virginia Company of London's plan to colonize Virginia for profit. By this time, King James I was king in England, and he had already granted a charter for this trip. The expedition set sail on the ship Discovery. They also had the Susan Constant and the Godspeed. During this voyage, John Smith was charged with mutiny and put in prison, but by the time they landed, they opened official orders from the king, which named John Smith the leader of the expedition, and they had to let him go. So he was under arrest for most of the trip, but by the time they landed at Cape Henry in 1607, they had to let him out, and he got spared from execution. By 1607, the colonists were still living in temporary housing and trying to figure out how they're going to navigate this brand new land with no food and nowhere to live. Ended in 1607 when Captain Wingfield, who was president of the council, picked Jamestown as the site for the new colony. After the 4-month ocean trip, they had food stores, only enough for a cup or 2 of grain a day. People were dying every day due to the nasty conditions and widespread disease. By September, so they picked Jamestown in May of that year. By September of that same year, more than 60 of the 104 who had come over on the ships were already dead. Jamestown was officially established in 1607, and John Smith trained the first settlers to farm and work. He famously established a rule that said, "He that will not work shall not eat." He based this declaration off of 2 Thessalonians 3:10. The harsh weather, the lack of food, and the nasty conditions, along with Indian attacks, almost destroyed the colonies. It was under John Smith's leadership that Jamestown survived and eventually flourished. John Smith was forced to return to England after he was injured in a gunpowder explosion. John Smith famously wrote about the new world that they were colonizing there and what they called New England, saying, "Here every man may be master and owner of his own labor and land. If he have nothing but his hands, he may by industries quickly grow rich." In early 1608, nearly 100 new settlers arrived on new ships, and this was very frustrating to the people that were already there because they already didn't have enough food and supplies. And England wasn't sending more, but they were just sending more people. They had named the newly found James River, and it froze over. During the summer of 1608, John Smith spent his time exploring the Chesapeake Bay area and produced the first map that was of great value to the Virginia explorers for more than a century John Smith's map would function as the main reference point for people in the area. While it's unclear what happened to John Smith while he was captured by the Powhatans, apparently he was accused of something for which they were going to kill him. John Smith would write later that the reason they did not kill him and indeed let him go was because of the efforts of the Powhatan chief's daughter, Pocahontas. John Smith would spend the rest of his life owing his life to Pocahontas and would even write to Queen Anne personally when Pocahontas visited England, requesting that Pocahontas be treated with the respect due a princess. Last week, I mentioned that the Sea Venture was the ship of one of 9 ships that John Smith set over to the Virginia colonies with in 1609 from England. And when he set out, the Sea Venture was actually being captained by John Rolfe, and it wrecked on the Bermuda Islands. And they finally made their way to Jamestown by 1610 after building the Deliverance and the Patience to take most of the passengers and crew off of Bermuda. And the new governor of Jamestown, Thomas Gates, was also on board. In August of 1609, John Smith was quite surprised to see more than 300 new settlers arrive, and he was very upset by this. So basically, they have more people than they can support. By mid-October of 1609, when John Smith did return to England because of the gunpowder injury we mentioned earlier, he would never go back to Virginia. But he did return to New England. In 1614, and this is the ship on which we think Squanto went with John Smith, he did return to New England, but this time instead of going to Virginia, he went to what is now Maine and Massachusetts Bay. During this expedition, Thomas Hunt rounded up a bunch of Indians and enslaved them, including Squanto, and John Smith would write about this event convinced that Thomas Hunt was specifically trying to hurt John Smith by doing this. He wanted to inflame the local population and cause a problem, and it's unclear what Thomas Hunt's motivations would have been for doing that, but John Smith suggested that he wanted to monopolize the resources, and so he was making it harder for people to come there. According to John Smith, Thomas Hunt stole the maps and notes of the area and was specifically trying to defeat John Smith's settlement plan. In 1616, John Smith published a map of the area, and it was the first map ever to be labeled as New England. Although the Indian place names were replaced by the names of the English colonies that were being established there, and several of the landmarks like rivers were replaced with English names as well. The Plymouth colonists, who would arrive later in the 1620s, would adopt John Smith's language for the area and indeed use his maps to navigate where they were and how to get around. John Smith would make 2 additional attempts to return to the area, and on the second one was captured by French pirates and placed in captivity. Once John Smith escaped captivity, he returned to England, where he would live out the remainder of his life. During that time in England, before he died, he would write out about his voyages in a book called A Description of New England. He would die and be buried in England at the end of his life. That's it for this week. That is the overlap of John Smith and William Shakespeare. You can find more about this in the show notes for today's episode, and there are maps and more. If you want to check the links to the side on this video, you can find places to explore this topic further, as it is our theme for the month of October. That's it for this week. I'm Cassidy Cash. I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'm here every Saturday, so hit like and subscribe if you like this video. And remember that if you'd like notifications about when new episodes become available, you do need to hit the little notification bell right next to the subscribe button. There's freebies available over in the show notes, including artwork and maps and copies of some of the maps that John Smith created. You can find all of that and more at cassidycash.com. Thanks for being here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.